Over the last couple of years, really the last few years, you've probably seen a fair amount of what you might call doom and gloom news stories regarding the sales figures for Samsung's flagship phones. While their A series phones continued to sell better and better, the S series phones were beginning to slip a little bit, as it seemed as though consumers were getting a bit bored with those phones. Now, unfortunately, in the last year or so, as the economy starts doing the things that economies occasionally do and turn a bit towards the southern direction, the A series phones began suffering a bit as well. And you may be wondering, what position does that leave Samsung in? Well, it turns out they're actually doing okay, because the S23 line, the newest version of the S series phones, is actually performing far better than I think anybody expected them to perform. Samsung has just announced that the S23 phones are selling 70% better than last year's S22 phones. And I find this really, really interesting, because so many people felt like the S23 Ultra looked like far too iterative of a release when compared to the S22 Ultra to garner a whole lot of excitement or sell many units. And like it occasionally happens, it appears that the experts, the people that felt that way, were just flat out wrong, because not only are they selling 70% better, the S23 Ultra is accounting for 60% of the overall sales of these S series phones. It is doing phenomenally well. I'm going to run through some quick numbers here. So in Europe, these phones are selling 1.5 times better. In Latin America, it's 1.7 times. In the Middle East, it's 1.5. India is 1.4. And they've already sold over 1 million units in South Korea alone. The S23 is absolutely killing. And yes, while on the surface, these phones did look like they were going to be pretty iterative releases, it turned out when you got them in your hands, they're a lot better than people thought they were going to be, and a lot of that is because of the new, better performance from the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, which is just insanely efficient when compared to the last version the Snapdragon released. You're looking at a phone that's going to have better performance, and not just a little bit better battery life, but like outstanding battery life when you're talking about the S23 phones, in particular the S23 Ultra. This is a phone that could routinely almost double up on my Z Fold 4 in terms of that longevity, and that is absolutely impressive when you factor in that it's also faster than my Z Fold 4. Now, while I haven't actually used the S23 or the S23 Plus, I have used the Ultra quite a bit now over the last few months, and honestly, this does not surprise me. The S23 Ultra is one of the most cohesive, one of the most completed feeling phones that I have ever used. There really isn't any screen you can observe, any animation, any behavior on this device that says to you this needs a little bit more polish. This phone does genuinely feel like the culmination of 10, 15 years worth of effort. And I know that that does sound like an insane amount of praise, but it's genuinely how I feel. There's virtually no weak point in this phone. How's the battery life? It's fantastic. How's the screen? It's fantastic. How's the camera? That's fantastic. How's the performance? Well, it's fantastic. There's really nothing about this phone. Does it have a pin? Yes, it's got a pin. It literally has everything you could possibly want. My only knock against it is that it's absolutely enormous, and that's just a subjective preference one way or the other. I prefer a phone to be a little bit more one-handable than that device is. But again, that's just a preference. You either like that or you don't. But just as the device, what it is one of the best smartphones that has ever been made, and I am far from the only one who feels this way. Now, another big aspect of this that is making this happen, you notice I mentioned a bunch of countries that weren't America. Well, why might this phone be selling like gangbusters in other countries? Well, that's because those other countries were used to getting their S23 phones, their I guess I should say the S series phones, running the Exynos processor that no one liked, and they finally got the Snapdragon version of these phones globally. So I'm guessing a lot of people said, oh, what's that? No Exynos this time around? It's a Snapdragon? And it's the best Snapdragon ever made? Yeah, I'm going to jump on board on that right now. That absolutely has sold units for Samsung. Now keep in mind, You're having to buy those chips from Qualcomm, whereas the Exynos ones, I should say, were their own. So there's a little bit of that going on, but they're clearly selling enough of these things in addition to make up for that difference. And you got to keep in mind that all of this is true with worse trade-ins being offered than we're used to seeing from Samsung. So this can only mean one thing. This is the strongest product that they've released in at least the last 3 or so years, and I think all the data bears that out, and that is also the experience of many other creators who have been using these Samsung phones for much longer than I have. Samsung's just absolutely killing it right now, and honestly, as good as the S23 Ultra is, really what this stands to do is make me that much more excited for the Z Fold 5, which is going to fold flat and have less of a crease, and I feel like might be that super duper complete phone that we're seeing with the S23, but in the Fold design. I already felt like the Fold 4 was a massive improvement over the prior Folds. It really was rounding itself out and becoming that completed product. The Fold 5, guys, Five Guys like the burgers? No, the Fold 5, guys, I am genuinely extremely excited for because of how good the S23 Ultra is. That level of polish to the hardware, to the software, potentially coming to the Fold with that new Snapdragon, which I think is going to make a massive difference. Sign me up. And you're going to want to be signed up to be a subscriber to this channel. Hit that sub button down below so you don't miss out on more content just like this. And until next time, stay nerdy, my friends.